They call him the Man of Steel. They say he's invincible, a being who carries the weight of the world on his shoulders. But what happens when that weight crushes him? Because even the strongest man alive still has a heart that can break. Superman is more than an alien, more than a hero. He is a son, a friend, a husband, a father. And when tragedy strikes, those roles matter more than his powers. Kryptonite may wound his body, but grief pierces his soul. Let's step into the hidden side of Clark Kent. The side the world rarely sees. The side where Superman cries. From his earliest days, Clark understood loss. The destruction of Krypton was his first grief. He never knew his birth parents beyond a recording, but he carried the unshakable truth. An entire world, an entire people, gone forever. Imagine being the last of your kind. The survivor's guilt runs deep. Every smile, every victory he wins on Earth is shadowed by that absence. Yet, Jonathan and Martha Kent gave him love, grounding him in Kansas soil. They became his anchor. They taught him kindness, humility, and hope. But even anchors can break. In many stories, Clark loses Jonathan Kent early in his life. For a man who can stop meteors, outfly missiles, and hear a whisper across the planet, standing helpless while his father's heart fails is unbearable. It's a grief Clark never forgets. A reminder that he cannot save everyone. That his powers have limits. And that sometimes the universe is cruel, no matter how hard you fight it. But grief doesn't only live in death. Superman's grief often comes from betrayal, from the weight of choices he couldn't prevent. Take the countless battles where his enemies turn friends against him. When Lois Lane has been endangered, brainwashed, or worse, killed in alternate timelines, Clark has unraveled. In Injustice, the death of Lois and their unborn child pushes him into darkness. It shows us something terrifying. Grief doesn't just weaken Superman. It can change him, can turn his boundless hope into tyranny. This is the paradox of Superman's sorrow. On one hand, it makes him human. It gives him empathy. He knows the pain of every man and woman who has lost someone they loved. On the other hand, it makes him dangerous, because a god in mourning is a storm without end. But let's slow down, because Superman's grief isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent. Imagine him flying alone above Earth at night. Cities asleep below him, stars stretching above. His superhearing muted, just for a moment of silence. And in that quiet he thinks of Krypton. Of his father's smile. Of every life he couldn't save. Those moments of solitude are where his grief lives. Not in the battles. Not in the speeches. But in the silence between them. And yet, Superman never lets grief consume him for long. Why? Because of his identity as Clark Kent. His humanity saves him. Lois, Jimmy, Perry, Martha. They remind him that he is not alone. That grief, while heavy, doesn't have to be carried in silence. Still, the question remains. How much grief can even Superman take? That's the story we're about to uncover. Because while many see Superman as a symbol of hope, behind that symbol lies a man who has buried worlds, fathers, and dreams. A man who has faced heartbreak so great it could shatter mountains. And yet, he keeps flying. But how? How does he carry that sorrow and still shine brighter than the sun? To answer that, we must dive deeper. Into the moments where grief nearly destroyed him. Into the choices where he almost broke. And into the truth of why grief is Superman's greatest weakness and perhaps his greatest strength. Because the Man of Steel may not bend under pressure, but even steel can crack. Stay with me. The story of Superman's grief is just beginning. Grief is not always sudden. Sometimes it builds. Quietly, patiently. Like cracks in glass you don't notice until it shatters. For Superman, the hardest grief is not just the loss of one life. It is the weight of millions. Every day he hears disasters across the globe. Earthquakes, fires, wars. Screams he cannot answer in time. Imagine having the power to save everyone, yet knowing you can't. That guilt builds inside him like a storm. He hides it well. To the world, he's the smiling hero, the man who never falters. But inside, Clark Kent knows the truth. He is haunted by the voices he didn't reach. Every life lost whispers in his memory. And no matter how many times he saves the day, grief always reminds him, he is not enough. One of Superman's darkest moments came when Doomsday arrived. The monster was unstoppable, brutal, pure destruction. And in that battle, Superman fought harder than he ever had before. Blow after blow. Until finally both warrior and beast fell. Superman died saving the world. But in truth, it wasn't his death that carried the grief. It was the aftermath. The world saw its greatest protector lifeless. Lois cradled his body in the streets of Metropolis. His friends, Batman, Wonder Woman, the Justice League, were shaken. For once, the world realized hope could die. And when Superman returned, reborn through Kryptonian resurrection, he carried something heavier than death, the grief of seeing how the world broke without him. How close humanity came to despair. How fragile everything truly is. He came back stronger, but quieter. More aware of the cost of his absence. But grief doesn't only come from loss in battle. Sometimes it comes from the people closest to him. Take Lois Lane. She is his heart, his anchor, but she is also mortal. Fragile in ways Clark can never accept. When Lois is endangered, Clark's fear of loss consumes him. In some timelines, that fear becomes reality. Alternate futures have shown Lois killed in Crossfire, assassinated, or worst of all, used as a weapon against him. In one haunting story, the Joker tricks Superman into killing Lois, believing she is Doomsday. That single act breaks him. It unravels his morality. From grief comes rage. From rage comes dictatorship. This is the world of injustice. A world where Superman's hope collapses into iron rule. This shows us something vital. Superman's grief does not always make him noble. Sometimes it makes him dangerous. Because if you give a god enough pain, he may decide to end pain forever, even if it means ending freedom with it. Yet, not every grief leads to darkness. Sometimes it creates compassion. Clark often thinks about orphans. Because in his grief as Krypton's last son, he understands what it means to lose family, culture, and identity. That grief shapes his kindness toward others, toward children who feel alone, toward refugees with no home, toward heroes like Batman who carry their own scars. His grief connects him to humanity. It reminds him he isn't above them. He is them. Still, grief never leaves. It waits. It returns in waves. When Superman visits the Fortress of Solitude, he walks among holograms of Krypton. He hears recordings of Jor-El. He sees the parents he never truly knew. And in those moments, grief is no longer anger or guilt. It is longing. It is the silence of a son reaching for a family he can never touch. But perhaps the cruelest grief of all comes not from death, but from the burden of time. Clark is not just powerful, he is enduring. He will live far longer than those he loves. Lois, Bruce, Diana, eventually all will fade. And Superman will remain. Immortal in a world that changes around him. He has seen futures where he walks alone, centuries after his friends are gone. A god trapped in eternal grief. That knowledge haunts him even now. Every smile, every kiss, every moment of joy carries the shadow of an ending he cannot stop. And so, Superman grieves even the future. Loss is not yet written, but certain. This is the paradox of his hope. To the world, he is a symbol of light. But within him, hope and grief wrestle endlessly. One moment, his grief fuels his compassion. The next, it tempts him toward despair. The question is, What stops Superman from breaking completely? How does he carry the grief of worlds, the grief of friends, the grief of love, and still rise each day to save us? That answer lies not in Krypton, not in power, but in the one thing grief cannot destroy: humanity. And in the next chapter we will see how Clark Kent, the man beneath the cape, finds strength through grief, and why it makes him not weaker, but greater. Because grief is not the end of Superman's story. It is the reason his story matters. Superman's grief could have broken him. It could have turned him into a tyrant in every world. It could have silenced his compassion. But it didn't. And the reason is simple: Clark Kent. Before he was Superman, he was the boy from Kansas. Raised by Jonathan and Martha, Kentucky. Farmers who knew nothing of Krypton but everything about humanity. They taught him humility. They taught him restraint. But more than that, they taught him how to grieve. When young Clark's dog died, Jonathan didn't hide it. He didn't tell him to be strong like a hero. He told him to mourn, to cry, to feel. He told him grief was part of love. That lesson, small as it was, became the foundation of Superman's soul. When Krypton was gone, when the fortress whispered with ghosts, when even the Justice League couldn't understand the loneliness of being the last of his kind, Clark remembered the fields of Kansas. The way Martha held him when he fell. The way Jonathan reminded him that pain is not weakness. That grief is not failure. That carrying sorrow with dignity is its own kind of strength. This is why Superman does not collapse under grief. He bends. He breaks. But he returns. Because Clark Kent never forgets what his parents taught him. The human heart is stronger than the Kryptonian body. Lois Lane is another anchor. Not just as his wife or lover, but as a reminder that the world is not perfect, and does not need to be. Lois is mortal. She makes mistakes. She bleeds. She grows older. But she lives with courage, knowing every day could be her last. That courage becomes Clark's answer to grief. When he fears losing her, Lois reminds him, if you only live in fear of endings, you miss the life we have. It grounds him. It keeps him from turning grief into obsession. And then there's the Justice League. Batman lost his parents. Wonder Woman lost her people. Flash lost his mother. Martian Manhunter lost his entire race. Each of them carries grief, just as heavy as his own. And when Superman falters, they remind him he isn't alone. Batman once told him, "It's not your job to save everyone. It's your job to try." And in that truth, Clark finds peace. Because grief will always exist. He cannot erase it. But he can stand against it. Not as a god. As a man trying again and again. Still, the question remains. Why doesn't grief consume Superman? Why doesn't he drown in loss the way injustice showed he could? The answer is hope. But not blind hope. Not shallow optimism. His hope is born through grief. He knows death. He knows loss. He knows he cannot stop every tragedy. Yet he chooses to rise anyway. That choice every morning is what makes him Superman. Hope for Clark is not pretending grief doesn't exist. It's carrying grief on his shoulders and still smiling. It's saving one life, even when he knows he cannot save them all. It's holding Lois close, knowing one day she'll be gone, but cherishing every moment until then. Grief does not end his story. It fuels it. And that is why, to us, Superman is more than a hero. He is a mirror. Because every person who has ever loved, lost, and carried sorrow sees themselves in him. He may fly through the skies, but at his core, he is a grieving man who refuses to stop loving the world. That's the real strength of Superman. Not invulnerability. Not flight. Not heat vision. But the courage to live with grief and still give hope to others. And perhaps that is why he inspires more than any hero in history. Because if Superman, carrying the weight of whole worlds, can rise from grief, then maybe we can too. So the next time you see Superman smile, remember, it isn't because he is untouched by pain. It is because he has known grief and chosen hope anyway. That is his true power. That is why he endures. And that is why Superman will always be more than a symbol. He is the living proof that grief does not destroy us. It makes us human.